There was something on the ground. It had crashed, there was wreckage, and as we found out much later, there were bodies.
Our government and other governments have been denying or covering up UFO evidence.
They were holding back on all this stuff. This was extraterrestrial in origin. It was outside of our technology of building something like that.
The UFO phenomenon is something highly complex and is composed of many, many different aspects.
Well, you have to ask the question, are they from another planet? We don't know the answer to that. A lot of people believe they're extraterrestrial. A lot of other people believe that they are from other dimensions, parallel universes, time travelers, that they're us at 2 million years in the future.
These extraterrestrials have been manipulating life on this planet for eons.
During that time, I saw a document entitled Operation Blue Fly Report 314. In that report, it states and makes it clear that what crashed was not an object that originated on this planet. It was, in fact, an object of extraterrestrial origin.
One of the most intriguing and one of the most enduring stories of unexplained encounters is the one universally referred to as the Roswell incident.
Roswell, New Mexico, a typical small town on the edge of a western desert until July 2nd, 1947. On that night, witnesses claim to have heard strange sounds and believe there was a flying saucer crash. The military took control of the area immediately, but at a press conference, they insisted it was just a weather balloon. But was the weather balloon story just an attempt to cover up the crash of some kind of unidentified alien craft? Was this a victim of the crash at Roswell, or just an elaborate hoax? What did a regular, down-to-earth cattle rancher encounter on his land that would catapult him into the world's spotlight? And why, to this day, have the events of that night remained unexplained?
Did a flying saucer, some kind of unearthly spacecraft, crash near Roswell, New Mexico, early in 1947? For over 50 years, investigators have been unable to even come close to agreement on what really took place there. Has the U.S. government recovered it and kept it hidden all these years? And what of the occupants, if any? What happened to them? Does the American government really know what fell from the sky that night? And if they do, will they admit it? And why, after more than 50 years, do UFO researchers still insist it's crucial that we learn the truth?
Roswell, as a mythic story, started in the mid-1970s. It didn't actually happen in the 1940s.
Roswell doesn't fit the standard flying disc reports because there was something on the ground, it had crashed, there was wreckage, and as we found out much later, there were bodies. The advocates and the opponents both have ignored almost all the relevant data which is obtained by talking to the right witnesses, looking up the records in the newspapers, following the story around the country. It was a major event in man's history.
Kevin Randall has devoted years of his life in an attempt to discover the truth and has written several exhaustive studies on the events at Roswell. As an enduring mystery should, it all began on a dark and stormy night in the summer of 1947.
The story that's been told is that Mac Brazel was alone at the ranch in early July 1947 during a thunderstorm, heard a clap of thunder that sounded much louder, different than the normal claps of thunder. Didn't think too much of it that night. The next day he was out on the range looking to see which fields had gotten the rain the night before because he was going to move the livestock, and as he explored the fields he came to an area that was filled with metallic debris.
Captain Randall and many others have said that the pieces of debris that Mac Brazel discovered were like nothing else on Earth. Mac Brazel then decided to bring the matter to the attention of the authorities. So he left the ranch and drove the few miles into the nearest town, Roswell, New Mexico. The sheriff of Roswell at the time was George Wilcox. His granddaughter, Barbara Duggar, recalls the story.
In the 40s, there was a spacecraft, a flying saucer is what Big Mom called it, crashed outside of Roswell. My grandmother stated that my grandfather went out there to the site. And when he got out there, there was a big burned area when they first approached the area. And then they saw debris. He saw debris. I don't know if he was alone. She was not with him. He went by himself. I asked her, I said, out of jokingness, did he see any little space beings? And she said, yes, there was 4 of them.
The sheriff, according to reports, immediately got in touch with the nearby Army Air Base about the field of strange debris. And it was only a short time before officers were on the scene, eager to see what the sheriff was talking about. After all, a field full of debris is one thing, but actual beings from outer space were quite another. What happened next appears to have been either the biggest mistake or the biggest cover-up in the history of the Air Force.
Major Jesse A. Marcel, the air intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group, was told by Colonel Blanchard to go out and take a look at the scene himself. Marcel got out there, again, saw an area that he described himself as 3/4 of a mile long, 200 to 300 feet wide, filled with metallic debris. He showed it to Colonel William Blanchard, the commander of the 509th Bomb Group. Blanchard ordered a press release saying that the Army had captured a flying saucer, talked to Lieutenant Walter Hott. Hott issued the press release, wrote the press release, and took it to the various media outlets in Roswell, the 2 radio stations, the 2 newspapers, and from that point it went over the wire.
The release read, in part, the many rumors regarding the flying discs became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers. But there was no mention of the space beings the sheriff told his family he had seen. Was this the beginning of a giant hoax or a giant cover-up? Barbara Duggar's grandmother was still afraid of repercussions 40 years after the event.
She said, the reason that I'm telling you this is because when the incident happened, the military police came to the courthouse, to the jailhouse, and told George and I that if we ever told anything about this incident, talked about it in any way, that not only we would be killed, but the family, that they would get the rest of the family.
But if the Air Force had already admitted publicly that they had in their possession a flying saucer, why threaten a local official and his family if they didn't keep silent?
Having been to 19 archives, I'm not surprised that we haven't found much in the way of file data on Roswell. The government knows how to cover things up. The Eisenhower Library still has 100,000 pages of classified material, all of it older than 1960. You don't get to see top secret code word documents when you go to archives. Very little has been released. If we're lucky, sometime in this century, we'll find out more.
Things soon began to take a different turn. What started out as a simple act of civic responsibility by a local rancher had suddenly become a major military activity. Mac Brazel never said he had seen a downed aircraft. Could it be that the Army discovered something he hadn't seen? And what of witnesses to the whole affair that are still living? What do they have to say today? As headquarters for the 509th Bomber Group, the only bomber group in the world capable of delivering atomic weapons, Roswell, New Mexico citizens were no strangers to terms like secrecy and classified. During the long days of World War II, they had become accustomed to the military's obsession with secrecy, but things were beginning to seem a bit extreme, even to these folks. According to Bill Brazel, Mac's son, his father was also sworn to secrecy. But secrecy about what? Had Mac Brazel found something more than just a field littered with strange debris?
This is basically the point where the Roswell incident becomes a whole series of different mysteries, and they kind of crisscross one another. Because if Colonel Blanchard admitted they had a more or less intact flying saucer, then clearly somewhere they had more than just the small bits of metallic debris reported by Mac Brazel.
According to many who were in Roswell at the time, the result of all the activity was a flood of attention focused on this small New Mexico town. But what happened next only added to the confusion.
3 hours later, the official story changes. General Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth, the parent unit to the 509th Bomb Group, now said it was nothing more than a meteorological balloon with a fairly common radar reflector attached to it. According to General Ramey, the balloon had crashed on the ranch. That's what Major Marcel found. He had overreacted thinking that he had a flying saucer. It was just this weather balloon and the Raywin target reflector.
Could it be that this photograph was a total fabrication? Here's what the officer on the right, General Thomas DuBose, had to say about the Army Air Force press release claiming the crash was just a weather balloon.
We knew that it was a cover story, and whose idea it was, I haven't the vaguest idea, but we used that in order to assuage the curiosity of the press.
Why would representatives of the U.S. military announce that the debris was from a weather balloon if their senior officers knew otherwise? As it turns out, the officers weren't the only ones to see the debris in General Ramey's office. Encounters researchers recently uncovered a civilian photographer who not only saw the debris Major Marcel brought in, he actually photographed it.
On July the 8th, 1947, I was a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I was also a backup photographer there. On that afternoon, my city editor came over and said, go out to General Ramey's office. They're bringing in a flying saucer from Roswell, and we need shots of it. And hurry, because we're right on the East Coast deadline. So I hurried out to General Ramey's office, and when I arrived there, the general was not there, but was expected back momentarily. That gave me an opportunity to arrange some of the debris that I saw there on the floor and to try to make the best of a picture. I remember that it was a pretty smelly, burned odor, and it was not very photogenic at all. So in my frustration, I was trying to pose something that would make sense, and about that time the general came back in. He came immediately over and bent over and started to examine the material. And as we look at the photographs now, we see several packages of unopened material, so it had not all been laid out at that time. When the general started to examine it, I asked him, what is this, General? He shrugged his shoulders, said, damned if I know, and went ahead very intently and looking at the material. While I was taking his picture, he had a piece of paper in his hand that he kept shuffling about, and in the different pictures, he was moving this paper around his hand. And finally, in the last picture, he was actually reading the message that he had in his hand. From that moment, from the time I left, I was the only person there, only civilian there, the only photographer or media person there. And but from that moment on, that material has not been seen by anyone, and it's been locked up somewhere ever since. Why do I think that the scene changed drastically and the attitude changed? I think it was the message that the general was given just as he walked into that room that changed the whole picture at that moment. After 2 years of study, the Roswell Photo Interpretation Team, called RIPIT, has come up with some interesting observations based on the Ramey message. First of all, it mentions victims of the wreck forwarded to Fort Worth. Secondly, it talks about the recovery of the Roswell disk. Third, what is needed at the Roswell site. And then finally, it talks about explaining it as a weather balloon.
Maybe Mac Brazel did find a balloon, but the problem with this is it never explains all the other testimony. It does not explain all the debris.
The Roswell event and everything about it is incredibly complex, and without the kind of detailed and painstaking analysis that I've done over the past 8 years, it's virtually impossible to understand. But after all this research, I am firmly convinced that the Roswell mystery, so-called, has been solved. and it had nothing whatever to do with the crash of an extraterrestrial spacecraft or its recovery by the military.
Was the mystery at long last solved? Well, not quite yet. Another book, The Day After Roswell, was published in 1997. Its author, Colonel Philip Corso, takes a completely different view. Corso worked in the Pentagon for Army intelligence for a number of years and was National Security Advisor during the Eisenhower administration. He is the most credible witness to come forward.
There's something up there flying around that's beyond our technical capability. We have nothing that can go 3,000-4,000 miles an hour and break the lock that quick on a radar.
Jesse Marcel Jr., son of the intelligence officer who first examined the debris field, has come forth with an amazing story having to do with that debris that he remembers from his childhood.
Major Marcel brought some of the material home so they could show it to his wife and his son. Then later on he took all of that material back to the Roswell Army Airfield.
He picked it up off the mountainside.
The thing that set this apart from anything that I'd ever seen before or since was the markings on parts of the wreckage. In the I-beam structural members, there was like a writing of sorts. I remember at the time thinking this was like hieroglyphic, but it wasn't really hieroglyphic, but it was more of geometrical forms and symbols.
These markings drew attention of a number of Roswell investigators, and an effort was launched with mixed results. One Native American source translated the glyphs to say, "Female warriors are ready and prepared." Another attempt at translation from a Mediterranean source claimed that the characters were a form of ancient Greek. The English translation, according to this source, was freedom. A word fragment is hardly enough to base any conclusions on, but the questions raised by just the idea that they are words boggles the mind. And why or how would an alien culture use the ancient Greek letters in the construction of their craft? Could this mean that there is literally a universal language?
Roswell was a focal point in man's history because southeastern New Mexico was where we were testing atomic bombs. We tested one here, the first one, where we're firing German V-2 rockets, where we had our best radar. Any visiting alien would recognize that here was the technology that would take Earthlings into outer space. It was certainly worth looking at. They had an accident.
Still, the weather balloon explanation was very nearly the end of what we know today as the Roswell incident, but there were about to be even more startling discoveries. One of the things that keeps the Roswell story alive even today is the story told by this man, Grady Barnett, a civil engineer living in Roswell at the time. Grady Barnett told his friend Vern Maltese what he saw that July afternoon.
Mr. Barnett told me that when he was coming back from one of his field trips, he'd run onto a flying saucer that had burst open, and there were 4 beings on the ground.
4 alien beings, as well as an almost intact spacecraft. The number of beings coincides exactly with what Sheriff George Wilcox said he found. Civil engineer Grady Barnett claimed to have seen a crashed flying saucer and the dead occupants of that craft. Could this be the same craft the Army Air Force later claimed to have in its possession? But if Grady Barnett's flying saucer was almost entirely intact, what could account for the massive amount of debris discovered by Mac Brazel? And there was something else. Barnett said all the beings he saw were dead. Sheriff Wilcox told a slightly different story.
And Granddaddy said their heads were large, and the little suit that they had on was just, you couldn't, it was just like silk or something. And I asked her, I said, were the little men alive? Were they dead? And she said, I think one of them was alive.
Some theorists have suggested that there were 2 flying saucers rather than just one, each carrying a crew of 4. Some UFO researchers believe that this is the only explanation. By all accounts, the debris was all very small. If these were pieces of a craft of some kind, it must have been totally obliterated.
Based on first-hand accounts of other people who were involved, it's clear that the solution to the mystery was going to be found miles away from the Brazel Ranch, much closer to Roswell. Since the vessel was made of such super strong material, whatever destroyed it must have been a tremendous force.
And what about the material found at the Mac Brazel Ranch? Some who claim to have handled the debris say it was clearly something they had never seen before.
The material discovered at the debris field defied all attempts of the people to explain what it was. The foil could not be cut, the wood-like material couldn't be whittled, it couldn't be burned. So clearly we have material that is not like anything that was available in our society in 1947.
Is it possible that the pieces of debris found on the ranch were really quite natural? For example, could they have come from a meteorite?
Well, a meteor would enter the Earth's atmosphere at, of course, very high speed. And once it meets the resistance of the Earth's atmosphere, it begins to burn up and lose, of course, its size. And what's more, a meteor that landed with an audible impact would have left a gigantic impact crater, such as the one in Arizona.
Whatever struck the ground in New Mexico left no crater. Did create a gouge in the terrain, but that's more suggestive of some kind of a controlled crash than something falling out of the sky.
But something apparently did fall out of the sky that night. A meteor seems an unlikely explanation, and UFO investigators are unwilling to accept the weather balloon scenario. Are there other possibilities? Has the Air Force offered any other explanations?
We're dealing with something which is interdimensional. We're probably dealing with something which has been around for a very long time, not just since 1947. The UFO phenomenon is something highly complex and is composed of many, many different aspects.
Well, you have to ask the question, are they from another planet? We don't know the answer to that. A lot of people believe they're extraterrestrial. A lot of other people believe that they are from other dimensions, parallel universes, time travelers, that they're us at 2 million years in the future, maybe separated from our reality by some thin psychic membrane.
We've concluded that some of the intelligences that we are interrelating with apparently are multidimensional. That really upsets a lot of people. I find it exciting, but it bothers a lot of people.
No, they just walked through it like it was made of air.
That concept in itself turns our idea of physics, the old Newtonian Einstein idea of physics, totally upside down.
So if UFOs are made by beings who are masters of such advanced technology, what could they gain from visiting our relatively primitive world?
If a craft of some kind was recovered over 50 years ago, have we learned anything from the technology that it brought here? What Mac Brazel, Sheriff Wilcox, Jesse Marcel, and the entire U.S. Army Air Force encountered that night near Roswell, New Mexico, put this small town in an international spotlight. That was not something the government liked particularly, since Roswell Army Airfield was home to the world's only bomber group capable of delivering atomic weapons. That fact has led some to suggest the wreckage might have been from some super-secret spy plane. During the late 1940s, the former Soviet Union was very curious about American nuclear bomb experiments, which were conducted only 100 miles from Roswell. A spy plane trying to capture these secrets would logically fly to that part of the country.
The Soviet Union had nothing of the kind in 1947. In fact, using Freedom of Information, we checked to see if any Soviet aircraft had penetrated the coastal defense zones in 1947. Absolutely no evidence of any Soviet attempts to fly any kind of aircraft inside the United States in that time frame.
But UFO researchers have recently discovered that the Soviet Union did have an interest in Roswell. George Knapp took his investigative reporter skills to the former Soviet Union, where he discovered that the Russians had a very high level of interest in the events surrounding Roswell in 1947, and they came to some startling conclusions.
We met a scientist while we were in Russia who worked under a guy named Sergei Korolev, who's the father of Russian rocketry. And Korolev had told this doctor about his meeting with Joseph Stalin in the late 1940s. Stalin had an intense interest in UFOs, and one of the things he wanted to know about was Roswell. At the time, the late 40s, Roswell, New Mexico, was a hotbed of Russian espionage activity because we had so many secret military programs there. So they heard about Roswell, and they were curious about it. And he had his scientists and his spies study it, and the conclusion they came up with was that Roswell was real, that something really did crash there, that it wasn't a weather balloon, and it wasn't anything of earthly origin. They didn't know exactly where it came from, but they knew it wasn't ours and it wasn't theirs, and this was something that was of monumental importance that needed to be studied.
There's no question that scientists and others in the Soviet Union have been interested in gathering information about flying saucers. What we don't know is what is in the secret boxes, so to speak, and just as we don't know what the U.S. government has. I suspect, because we've spent so much money on spy satellites and other such systems, that we probably have better data than they do, because we tried to avoid shooting down vehicles. Russians supposedly tried to keep shooting them down to get something to learn from. That didn't go over well with the aliens, as I hear the story. So I think they have plenty of data. We won't get access to that any more than we Americans have access to American data.
Some groups call it the Wise Men, the Magi, Magic 12, MJ-12. It was an organization that was apparently appointed as early as 1947-49 to deal with this issue, to study it, to establish some policy and make some policy on how are we going to respond? How are we going to deal with the reality of extraterrestrial alien involvement? Now, an organization very much like that still exists, but they don't call it MJ-12 anymore. It is literally a multinational, multi-agency, international organization trying to keep the lid on this thing, to keep the cover on it, to control the release of the information.
They put a great deal of effort into concealing what they do know about the extraterrestrials.
The lie and the cover-up has literally threatened our constitutional process. And that's why I'm involved, why I'm speaking out, why I'm violating my national security oath by doing so, because eventually it's going to affect the lives of every man, woman, and child on the planet. And it's crucial that people start to pay attention. It's crucial that the government starts to tell us the truth.
Still, at the center of this story was the man who had, in essence, started it all, Mac Brazel.
What's going on here?
Brazel, we are told, was a virtual prisoner of the military at the ranch. If this is true, then it would seem the Army feared that he might tell others the truth about what he had seen. Then, another unexpected development in the Roswell incident. The story now took a remarkable turn. Investigators claim Mac Brazel escaped from the Army and headed straight for the people he knew he could trust.
This way.
His friends at radio station KGFL in Roswell would later tell how they hid Brazel in one of their houses.
We offered him a place to stay that night so he could get away from a lot of people with questions.
The plan had been to broadcast an interview with Mac Brazel, but Judd Roberts tells us that he'd gotten a number of phone calls from Washington, D.C. that prevented them from broadcasting the interview.
The suggestion was made to us that if we wanted to keep our license, we would not use the interview on the air because that would give us about 24 hours to find something else to do beside the radio business.
It was only a weather balloon. Could it really be true that the Army would use coercive tactics to ensure Mac Brazel's silence? If so, silence about what?
Once Brazel was in the hands of the military police, he was kept at the guest house on the base under armed guard. Not exactly jail, but close enough. On the evening of July 9th, the military took Mac Brazel to the various media outlets in Roswell, and here he was telling them a story that differed significantly than what he had told them on July 6th.
What I found yesterday in my field was a weather balloon.
Was a what?
What happened to Mac Brazel during the time he was in custody? Why did he change his story? Could it be that Mac Brazel planned to reveal the same story later told by mortician Glenn Dennis?
In 1947, Glenn Dennis worked at the Ballard Funeral Home. In small towns, often the hearse doubled as an ambulance, and Glenn Dennis would have an opportunity to drive injured airmen back out to the base. Once he arrived at the hospital and escorted the airmen into the emergency room, he had an opportunity to see some of the metallic debris that had been collected on the debris field in the back of ambulances as he walked by them.
Excuse me, sir, this is private property. I said, it looks like you've had a crash. I said, I see some debris and then the ambulance is there. And that's probably where I really got in trouble right there.
Hey, what do you got there, Mom? Look, I just want to know what you've got right there.
You say one word to anybody, and you're dead.
Glenn was told in very blunt language that if he ever talked about this, if he went into town and told his friends about it, he'd be killed.
But Glenn Dennis's connection to the Roswell incident did not end there. He would soon learn much more from his girlfriend, a nurse at the base hospital.
And this was a young second lieutenant, a very deeply religious lady. She was born and raised in a very strict Catholic family. She was going into this examination room that was across the hall. She was going in to get some supplies, and when she walked in the door, there was two doctors there. She started out the door and said, "You stay here, we've got to have you." And what it was, they were examining, she told me, 3 bodies, foreign bodies. She said 2 of them were very mutilated. She said, "I've got to go back to the barracks." He said, "I am deathly ill and I've got to go back to the barracks." And then that was the last time I ever saw her. The next day, I called out. I wanted to see how she was doing and how she was feeling, and they said that she had been transferred out. And they didn't know where, but she was no longer there at the air base.
What do you mean she's not available? Miss, excuse me?
What happened to the nurse that was pressed into duty on that fateful July day? More importantly, what did she see? Is there any evidence to suggest actual bodies were found? Did anyone else actually see what the doctors saw? If they did, would they ever come forward in spite of the threats? In July of 1997, people from all over the world beat a path to Roswell, New Mexico. The town's population virtually doubled overnight to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of what many believe to be the Roswell crash. Coincidentally, perhaps, July 1997 was also the time the United States Air Force chose to issue something called the Roswell Report, case closed. The Air Force may consider the case closed, but to many UFO investigators, the report simply added fuel to the controversial fire.
The press was ready when the Roswell story broke. Wow, we have something. Air Force issued instructions to cover it up. General Ramey said it was just a radar reflector from a weather balloon. So in less than a day, the story fizzled entirely until I got involved 30 years later. When finally those stories came out, it was clear that the Air Force explanation did not address bodies, didn't say anything about them. So they came up with crash test dummies, which were indeed dropped in New Mexico. But 6 years later, and all the dummies were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds to simulate pilots. All the alien reports were of beings shorter than 4.5 feet. They must think we're all dummies.
But beyond the hearsay evidence, is there any proof that creatures of some kind were aboard the craft? This highly controversial piece of film was supposedly shot by a military cameraman in 1947 during an autopsy of one of the alien beings. Could this be the body of a being from another world? Hotly debated since the film was first released in 1995. There were opinions aplenty on both sides, but nothing to corroborate what the film seemed to portray until this man came forward, retired Air Force Colonel Philip Corso, adjunct to General Trudeau, and a former intelligence officer with every clearance the Pentagon gives. For many years, investigators have wondered at the seemingly sudden burst of technology that exploded on the American industrial scene in the mid-20th century. Lightweight night vision, integrated computer circuits, fiber optics, and the whole range of technology necessary to put a man on the moon. Could this technological jumpstart have had something to do with the Roswell crash? According to his book, The Day After Roswell, Colonel Corso himself was the man responsible for seeding alien technology into American industry.
And it was a bunch of wires, which I didn't even know what they were, which were emitting colors. I didn't even know if they were wires. I had this chip, this integrated circuit, a laser instrument. They could do like some of the fine cuttings that they said in animal mutilations. And I had also fiber optics. I wasn't sure what the chip was. Integrated circuit in those days, a little beyond me. So I started talking to people and I figured, well, geez, this must be important. So that went, the write-up I made went to Bell Lab.
Having worked in industry on advanced research and development programs for a lot of years under security, I think we may have learned a great deal from flying saucers, but I don't think that that explains the enormous upsurge of new technology. If you gave Christopher Columbus a nuclear submarine, he could not have built another one. If aliens are 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 years ahead of us, we're not going to be easily able to duplicate their technology.
But Colonel Corso's credentials were impeccable, so much so that it wasn't until after his death that critics came forward to challenge his book. Yet, as astonishing as his revelations regarding technology were, it was his assertions about Roswell 50 years after the fact that put the crash, recovery of bodies, and the autopsy film in a whole new light.
I learned about the Roswell crash when I was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas. And I was the duty officer that night. And that meant I was in charge of the security of the whole area, including the inspection of the guards, every place where they were. So I went around about 2 or 3 in the morning to the veterinarian area, because we had horses at Fort Riley then. And one of the sergeants that I knew was a sergeant of the guard. I used to bowl with him. And I told him, Sergeant, how's everything going? They told me at headquarters that this area was very secure. He said, yes, come on, Colonel. He said, I want to show you something. So he took me back in the back room, and there was 5 crates. They looked like crates there. Lifted up a tarpaulin on one, I did, and here's this body there. And it was filling in fluid. And then I took a good look at it, and this lasted about 10 or 15 seconds only. At first I thought it was maybe a child, because it was only about 5 feet. And I figured, what is that?
The colonel reported that the sight of the thing gave him the same queasy feeling in the pit of his stomach as seeing men killed in combat, but he was able to describe what he saw in some detail.
The chest was small, sort of, and the skin looked sort of grayish color. And then the head was large for the proportion of the body. Not real big now, but large. And the eyes were both slanted, sort of. And they had about a half a filament on them.
Here was a man, deep in the intelligence community, actually admitting that not only did the military have alien bodies, but that he had seen them. But it would be 14 years before the significance of what he had seen would be impressed upon him. His most shocking revelations were yet to come.
And I had the reports on autopsy that performed at Walter Reed on our lab, which we financed at Walter Reed. And when I read that, it matched with what I saw at Fort Riley 14 years before. The whole autopsy was similar to what I had seen.
If the colonel is to be believed, not only were these strange beings autopsied in Roswell, but at Walter Reed Army Hospital as well. But what about that highly controversial autopsy film? Could the colonel shed any light on its authenticity?
Well, there was some truth to that, because they pulled out an eyelid, and no one knew about that eyelid. That eyelid was a light gatherer so they could see in the dark. They had it in a sort of a container, and the brain was in there. And it looked like the one that was described in these documents I had.
Could it be that Colonel Corso has at last given us the clues we need to confirm what actually happened as a result of the Roswell incident?
We know that some sort of extraterrestrial object crashed in New Mexico in July of 1947. But according to the first-hand witnesses, it was no vehicle made on Earth. Apparently the bodies and the metallic debris were impounded by the military. If all of this is true, and the evidence strongly suggests that it is, then our government, for some reason, has taken the stance that the general public must not be told the truth.
But why? Why would our government wish to conceal the fact that alien beings have come to our world? And do we know for certain that they have concealed such evidence?
All you need to do is pick up a couple of well-documented books who have done the work we should be doing, which is going through the Freedom of Information Acts and requesting the covert or the secret information that has been kept from us that will verify for anyone who doubts our government's involvement in their own words, in their own documents.
Regardless of what any of us may believe about Roswell, I don't think that there's any disagreement at all that it's important to document the truth wherever possible. Unfortunately, Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, does not document the truth. It's a collection of misstatements, lies, and fantasy. And quite simply, it's nothing but a hoax.
Nothing about Roswell, it seems, can go unchallenged. But if this is the real solution to the Roswell mystery at last, it unfortunately only raises other equally disturbing questions. If there were two saucers, or only one that broke into pieces, where are all those pieces now? And if the alien pilots really were taken away from the crash site, what became of them? Sappho Henderson was married to an Army Air Force pilot flying out of Roswell at the time who shared his secret with her.
And he said, well, I guess now that they're putting in the paper, I can tell you about this. I wanted to tell you for years. He said, I want you to read this article because it's a true story. And I not only know that it's true, but I'm the pilot who flew the wreckage of the UFO to Dayton, Ohio.
There was one man, Pappy Henderson, a pilot at the base, a noted pilot, who had told a colleague, a dentist, with whom he shared a great interest in materials, that he had a piece of the wreckage. He showed it to him, took it back, unfortunately. Some other people connected with Pappy saw that piece as well. If one person had a sample of wreckage, others did, and that's what we're looking for today.
Was undeniable proof of extraterrestrial life carefully transported to Dayton, Ohio? Is the incident at Roswell really a closed case, as the Air Force suggests? Has all the controversy and investigation produced any conclusions at all?
So we came to the conclusion these creatures, whatever they are made to travel in space. And then gradually through what the work we did, we found out that this integrated with the flying saucer, and really, because most of the failures in making flying saucers were the guidance system. That this creature was also the guidance system, was part of the engine.
These are supposedly control panels from the alien craft. Are these indentations in the shape of the alien hands the means by which the beings connected to the craft and became part of the engine?
We know enough about what happened to realize the government collected everything. They policed the area, they gathered the craft, they gathered the bodies. They picked up everything. Best evidence is that the spacecraft and the bodies were collected in Hangar 84 at the Roswell Army Airfield, and that they were then sent to other bases around the country. We know, based on, again, good testimony, that a preliminary autopsy was held at the base hospital. The nurse that Glenn Dennis knew said that she saw 3 bodies inside the base hospital. So we know 3 of them were at the hospital at one time. What we have are a large number of people, many of whom are unknown to one another, telling the same basic story from different points of view, from Mac Brazel on the debris field to the men such as Major Edwin Easley, who was on the impact site, telling a story that dovetails nicely. If it was a hoax, we would not have the corroborative testimony that has been offered by these people.
Could it be that there is finally a chink in the armor of silence that has protected the weather balloon story all these years?
53 years later, and having the benefit of quite a bit of examination, I now believe that the material, the debris that I photographed, and the 6 photographs that I took contain pictures of the real stuff. The authentic debris that was brought from Roswell was not a weather balloon, but was the real debris.
There's no question that there's a relationship between the UFO sightings leading up to the crash at Roswell and the crash at Roswell. In the 3 days preceding the crash at Roswell, there were 88 sightings of craft across 24 states And on July 4th, 1947, the day of the Roswell crash, it's estimated that over 10 million Americans saw flying saucers on that day.
The simplest explanation for the thousands of reports of flying saucers from all over the world is that the planet is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. Most sightings can be explained. It's the ones that can't that matter, and there are loads of those in every large-scale scientific study.
We're told that hundreds of people were connected, either eyewitnesses indirectly or directly, to the Roswell event. Doesn't this make it true? No, it doesn't, actually. First of all, the numbers grow over the decades. More and more people are telling others that they were there when, in fact, if you look into it, they weren't there at all. But the fact is, it doesn't matter how many people say they were there. You have to have more than just eyewitness accounts. You have to have some sort of corroborative evidence, some physical evidence. And until we see that, I'm just going to remain a skeptic.
I don't think you can argue with the thousands of reports, visual reports, sightings by credible people that have happened over the decades.
I and other researchers, we get these drawings and we look and we compare. And somebody in California has drawn something that looks like what somebody drew in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. These people have never seen each other. They don't know anything about each other's lives. And when you start and lay out all of these drawings and you say, what are the patterns that people have been reporting for decades? They break down into this category of what is known as the grays, sort of like we talk about Kleenex and Xerox now. There is this gray.
There's a number of aliens visiting here. It's not just a simple they, it's a very complex they, and they seem to be coming from everywhere on every kind of business, doing everything.
From personal knowledge, I can talk about two different kinds. From research with other people who've had the experiences, I know there are more different physical reported types.
There's another group that appears to have something like a reptilian quality. The pupils of their eyes are vertical.
I have personally seen the insectoid or praying mantis type creatures.
And then there's another group that about 8 feet tall, very pale, no hair at all, that are basically humanoid, but they're massive people. We may be dealing with over a dozen separate groups, maybe even more. We really don't know.
There are some variations, but about, I'd say, 85% of the descriptions fall in a particular range.
The vast majority of reports are of small beings, gray, maybe 4 feet tall, a little bit higher, a little bit taller, a little bit smaller sometimes.
We have very large heads.
No hair, no nose to speak of, no ears, a little slit for a mouth, very thin, pointed chin, thin body, thin arms, thin legs.
They have a tiny little thin neck, and many people are amazed that this little neck will hold this big head upright.
Very large black wraparound eyes, or just huge black almond-shaped eyes.
Sometimes the eyes are more slanted, sometimes they seem to be more horizontal, wrap around. There are variations there.
Disproportionately long fingers. Most of them had 4 fingers. Some were reported to have 3, others were reported to have 5, but they were generally characterized by 4 fingers, no opposed thumb, as we use.
2 legs, no more, 2 arms, no more, 2 eyes, no more, and whatever is absolutely the minimum needed for survival, and that's what we see in these beings.
The mystery of the incident at Roswell appears to be something that will remain unexplained. Still, the puzzle intrigues us and captivates the imagination in new and startling ways. Even as we speak, the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell is offering up to $1 million for the first scientifically verified piece of debris from the 1947 crash of an alien spacecraft. For those who claim to be eyewitnesses to whatever happened at Roswell, the event of July 1947 can never be forgotten. But until someone collects the $1 million or more evidence comes to the surface, what really happened at Roswell will have to remain an encounter with the unexplained.